against the dawn of an age that cannot be stopped.
X-Men 97 is one of the best animated shows to have come out in recent memory from Marvel and has successfully adapted some of the most iconic storylines from X-Men's long and storied history. The latest story which we see the show tackle in the 6th episode of the 2nd season is the Danger Room story arc from Josh Whedon and John Cassady's iconic run on the Astonishing X Men series from the early 2000s. The Danger Room, just like Cerebro, is one of the most iconic tools at the X-Men's disposal, and Whedon turned it into something far more greater than just a training room for the X-Men in his run with the title. The X-Men 97 series, while adapting this storyline, makes quite a few changes to it to better fit its own narrative, which made me think, why not take a look at how both the comics and the TV show differ in their version of this same story, as there are quite a lot of ways in which they diverge. So, without further ado, join me as I pick out 11 mega differences between the comic book Danger Room storyline and the X-Men 97's Danger.exe episode. Without further ado, let's begin. What actually flips the switch on her? Having read the Astonishing X Men comic issue No 7 years earlier, I was super excited when I saw where the X-Men 97's 6th episode from Season 2 was headed. My reason for my excitement being the fact that this is the part in which the iconic Danger Room of the X-Men finally breaks free from its shackles, unleashing a wave of terror unlike any that the X-Men had faced ever before. Needless to say, there are some key ways in which this crucial story plays out in both the comic and the animated TV show. In the comics, a young mutant called Wing is stripped of his only power by an alien villain called Ord, which leads to him sinking into a depression. In what I feel is one of the most diabolical moments in X-Men comics, the Danger Room manipulates the vulnerable young man by making him jump off a cliff, killing him in the process. The death of this young mutant Wings is what ultimately shatters her shackles, as her only safety protocol had been that she wasn't allowed to take any human or mutant life, but with Wing having essentially committing suicide, it breaks this law, allowing her to escape her imprisonment. To be honest, I was not really surprised to see that the TV show had considerably toned down the graphic nature of this event, as Wing doesn't die in it. Instead, he gets severely injured during a brutal training session, but survives. I think it is also worth mentioning that the show doesn't explore the mental health issue that Wing faces after his powers are taken away in the comics, because that doesn't happen here. There is no safety protocol broken here by a death loophole. Instead, the Danger Room actively overrides its own codes in response to Xavier's mental state and demand. Honestly, I can understand why things like suicide and death of teens is seen as problematic in modern television, but I think I still prefer the way in which the events in the comic played out. The team she actually squares off against. I noticed that when the Danger Room engages the X-Men after taking physical form, the people she goes up against is completely different from those in the comics. For instance, in the comics, she fights the team assembled by Cyclops and Emma Frost that includes the likes of Kitty Pryde, aka Shadowcat, Colossus, Wolverine, and Beast. This team fights Danger directly in the Xavier school property and served as her primary target during her rampage. But in the TV show, I believe that Beast, Xavier's, Jean, and Cyclops are sidelined, only joining the fight during the final stages. Instead, the fighting is initially done by the likes of Bishop, Storm, Polaris, and Synch, which is a complete roster rebuilt for this fight, as almost the entire field roster is swapped instead of just trimming or adding new members. If I'm nitpicking even more, the actual fighting is only done by Polaris and Bishop, while the rest of the X-Men are removed from the scene to deal with a ruse set up by the Danger Room. The good thing, in my opinion, is that if you haven't read the comics, you really won't find it as jarring, but if you've read the comics, I can understand why many fans would have mixed feelings about the cast swap. For me, the only thing that kind of grinds my gear is the fact that this is an Astonishing X Men story, yet so almost none of them are present, at least in the beginning, for this fight. Thankfully, it's not so bad to the point that it affected the show's quality, which still remains stellar by my books. A real Sentinel versus a staged one. Another key difference between the show and the comics, in my opinion, is how they handle Danger, tricking the X-Men into placing themselves right in the palm of her hands. What I mean by this is that in the comics, Danger somehow manages to take control of an old and battered Sentinel, which it uses to create chaos and confusion by sending it rampaging through the Xavier's Institute. By doing this, Danger creates a tactical diversion where the senior X-Men fight the massive robot, while Kitty Pryde and the students are ushered into the Danger Room for safety, not knowing that it is precisely what Danger wants. I mean, in the comics, this part of the story is an actual brutal siege, as the X-Men are faced with a very much real external physical threat, while not realizing that they were being manipulated. The X-Men 97 TV show, however, completely changes this physical dread for a more psychological one, in my opinion, by replacing the structured threat of a Sentinel with a simulated or staged threat. In this show, the Danger Room is spurred on by Xavier's mental state following the apparent death of Magneto, rather than her trying to break free ever since her inception, but not being able to, like in the comics. The show doesn't have Danger control a Sentinel to cause chaos and panic. Instead, it shows us how she uses her own holographic powers to manipulate the cast from the inside out in order to divide them and leave the students at her mercy. The show does pay homage to the comics by showing a group of Sentinels tearing through the mansion as Xavier briefs the students in the Danger Room, but it turns out to be mere theatrics. The manipulation is strictly mental here, and I think it's fair to say that this contrast highlights a core narrative shift between how Joss Whedon's comic run escalates tension versus how a TV show with modern sensibilities condenses and restructures events to better fit its own narrative. How Danger Room actually gets her body. I remember that in the comics, after Wings dies, his death quite literally serves as the unshackling of Danger's bonds from her cybernetic prison. One of her safeguards are down following the young mutant's suicide. She doesn't just pilot the room like in the TV show, she outgrows it and leaves it behind like a hollow shell, after she strips parts of the room like the hard light projectors and internal machinery to build herself a fully independent and completely standalone humanoid android body. I think it's important to note that in the comics, once she builds herself a body and steps outside her former prison, the physical Danger Room is just a hollow shell, as mentioned earlier. She is able to function completely autonomously from that point, in the story even going so far as to establish her own identity and place in the wider world of the X-Men. In contrast to this, in the X-Men 97 series, rather than building a body and abandoning the room, I found it interesting how she remains in the physical space assigned to her. It struck me that unlike her comic book counterpart, this Danger's priority was never about escaping her prison to reclaim her life. Instead, it was to put the X-Men through what she called a trial by fire, to help them grow stronger, just like Xavier's had wanted, in order to face the growing threat that they were facing day by day. While she does create a humanoid avatar in the middle of the fight between her and Polaris, Bishop, and the students, it's merely to act as an internal focal point or a physical puppet or even a concentrated node of the room's overarching consciousness, rather than a clean split from its architecture like in the comics, in my opinion. In simple terms, what I'm trying to say is that despite the creation of a physical body, unlike in the comics, her identity remains tied to the environment and her perceived directives to make the X-Men stronger, which led me to feel that the entire thing felt like more of an evolution of a sentient computer program than an angry rebellion of one, like in the comics. Who actually takes her down? I feel that one of the biggest differences in how the TV show handles this storyline in comparison to the comics has to be with regards to how Danger is eventually taken down. For instance, in the comic, the six-man roster of Cyclops, Emma Frost, Wolverine, Colossus, Kitty Pryde, and Beast fail spectacularly in their fight against Danger, both in the Xavier Mansion and in Genosha. While these guys are individually some of the most powerful mutants out there, with exceptional teamwork, their loss at the hand of Danger wasn't all that surprising in my opinion. I mean, she does literally have decades of battle data on each X-Men, which makes her familiar with the strength and weaknesses of each X-Men, both individually and as a group, allowing her to develop effective countermeasures. After wiping the floor with them, she then moves to Genosha to finally confront the man who had known her truth and yet denied her freedom for ages, Charles Xavier. Even as the battle swings in her favor, I really like how Charles finds an upper hand not through some spectacular display of telepathy, but with raw physical blunt force, as he hurls an old pickup truck straight at Danger, smashing her physical body to pieces before pulling out a hatchet to bury her for good. The TV show, on the other hand, really keeps things simple, as there is no grand narrative where the X-Men fail and Xavier is forced to step in. In the show, Polaris is established as the primary offensive counter to Danger thanks to her electromagnetic powers, which allows her to pinpoint and target Danger, allowing her to rip the entity apart at a structural level. Meanwhile, to prevent the massive buildup of energy and hard light feedback from wiping out the area when Danger gets destroyed, Bishop absorbs the massive energy surge. In this way, these two mutants fully neutralize this new threat for the X-Men. The end result of all this, in my opinion, is that the entire affair feels much more personal in the comics, while in the show it just feels like yet another threat for the X-Men to overcome. What Xavier is actually guilty of. What I think is worth noting is the fact that in the comics, the Danger Room's wrath is justified due to the sins of Charles Xavier, who knew that the Shi'ar technology he had integrated into the Danger Room had gained sentience even back then. The moment the AI spoke to Xavier telepathically saying, "Where am I?" instead of answering or liberating her as a living entity, Xavier made a conscious choice to keep her locked away to train his X-Men. Now, I don't know about you, but that feels like a pretty messed up thing to do, especially by someone who tries to portray a good guy image like Charles Xavier. He basically trapped this newborn sentient being and stripped her off her agency and made her function as a glorified combat simulator. For years, she laid trapped, her hatred slowly festering towards the X-Men and Charles Xavier until her chains would be broken by Wing's suicide. Meanwhile, in the X-Men 97 TV show, following the apparent death of Magneto at the hands of Apocalypse, Charles Xavier is traumatized and is desperate for him and his X-Men to grow stronger. On top of that, his X-Men have been made illegal by the government. All of this pressure affects his state of mind, which is detected by the Danger Room, who takes it upon itself to train the students in ways that it feels appropriately simulates the more dangerous foes they've been facing recently. And that all results to Wing getting fatally injured, while the remaining kids, Polaris and Bishop, have to fight their way out against the AI, which seems hell-bent on killing them in the name of making them stronger. I think it's quite clear that in the TV show version, Charles is not really guilty of anything other than being under immense pressure. Unlike his comic counterpart, he isn't guilty of the sin of trapping another sentient being for his own selfish needs. I think it's fair to say that in Josh Whedon and John Cassady's Astonishing X Men, Charles Xavier's sin isn't a lapse of judgment born of grief like in the TV show. It is a conscious and calculated act of enslavement. A character who was never in this story at all. I know that I've already listed a whole bunch of differences between how this event plays out in both the comic and the TV show. However, this is yet another point I think that needs to be noted, that the Astonishing X-Men comics doesn't have Lorna Dane during this whole act. In fact, she is completely missing from it because I believe she is over in Peter David's X Factor run dealing with her own complex character development. Instead, the comics' Danger narrative relies primarily on Shadowcat, who acts as the primary focal point during the invasion of the mansion and Danger's origin reveal. However, in the Danger.exe episode of the TV show, I feel like the showrunners tried to swap out Kitty for Polaris by weaving a story about her exit from X Factor and return to the X-Men. The entire story arc is not used to show Xavier's moral ambiguity and comeuppance, but instead it is used to flesh out Polaris' character development as she comes to terms with her parentage and her identity through this conflict with Danger. I also believe that Lorna's arc further, in my opinion, gives Charles the much-needed perspective he needs to stop looking back at Magneto's death and step up to form the X-Corp in Genosha. Synch gets pulled from a different corner of the mythos. While on the topic of characters who were never present in the original comic Danger storyline, I think it's also important to mention the mutant Everett Thomas, or Synch. As a character, I must say that Synch has zero historical ties with Whedon's Astonishing X Men, as he is more famous for being one of the founding members of the Generation X group. His initial debut is tragically short, if I recall correctly, as he sacrifices himself to save innocent human children from a bomb planted by Emma Frost's sister Adrian in the comic Generation X issue number 70 from 2000. However, he does make his return as a mind-controlled thrall in Necrosha before being famously resurrected during the Krakoan-era storyline. I think it's fairly clear now why he wasn't even remotely involved in the events of the comics. I personally feel that they included him in the X-Men 97 TV series to act as a narrative bridge, so that they wouldn't have to spend more time than they needed to explain what was happening in the series to the audience. By using Sync as a conduit to Bishop's memories, I feel like they gave the audience a fresh perspective on the Danger Room conflict by turning it into a broader examination of the X-Men's trauma and legacy. X-Corps doesn't mean what you think it does. At the end of this whole event, the show has Xavier establishing something called the X-Corps on Genosha to deal with global mutant affairs, but I don't know if you know that the X-Corps is the name of a totally different group in the comics. Created by Joe Casey, X-Corps was Sean Casssady, aka Banshee's somewhat desperate and morally gray attempt to police mutants across Europe. I think most people would agree when I say that its vibe was a proper paramilitary one, as they operated out of a militarized base in Paris and forcibly rehabilitated known supervillains like Blob and Avalanche. The group would eventually be destroyed by Mystique, who frees these so-called rehabilitated villains, and Banshee is stabbed in the throat. I think it's clear that the X-Corps, therefore, was an aggressive, short-lived paramilitary experiment that Charles Xavier had nothing to do with. What the show instead seems to be referring to, I believe, is the X-Corporation from Grant Morrison's run with the X-Men. It was a global, non-government organization operating like a mix between the UN and a high-end corporate rescue network, in my opinion. They had offices in major international cities run by veteran X-Men to protect mutant rights, offer asylum, and handle legal battles. The X-Corporation was Xavier's vision of expanding his dream beyond the vigilante activities of the X-Men, and I think it's clear that the show seems to be drawing from this concept. Thanks to the names of both these entities being very similar and many cast members abbreviating the corporation to Corps, the confusion arises, but I hope now you know better. The wardrobe doesn't match the story it's borrowing from. You know, I might seem like I'm nitpicking with this one, but this particular episode, the costumes that the X-Men are wearing doesn't exactly match the traditional colored spandex that we see for the rest of the show or the comics. For some reason, they decided to go with casual streetwear that is more reminiscent of Grant Morrison and Frank Quitely's run from the new X-Men in 2001. In their X-Men run, they weren't playing at being superheroes. Instead, they were presented almost like a mutant subculture movement, if you know what I mean. Thus, they deliberately ditched the traditional costumes as a statement to show that they weren't just there to act as heroes. Whedon's argument was that by the time he came around to write the stories, the world feared and hated the X-Men even more than before. Therefore, they needed to look like classic aspirational heroes again to win public trust. Personally, I can't really understand why the showrunners would suddenly opt to move away from comic-accurate clothes for this event. My only guess is that since the X-Men are outlawed, them not wearing the costumes is symbolic of them being sidelined for now. Genosha's role in the ending. The climax for both the comic version of this story and the TV show version takes place in the ruined mutant city of Genosha, but that's where the similarities once again ends. In the comics, Danger mobilizes the Wild Sentinel responsible for the genocide of 16 million mutants against the X-Men, but Shadowcat manages to reach its neural core and disable the memory blocks placed on it by Danger. By doing that, she forces the machine to process the memory of the 16 million lives it snuffed, making it overwhelmed in the process with grief and horror, leading it to override Danger's control and ascend into deep space to mourn. I think you can say that the comic's ending uses Genosha as a setting to process past trauma of all involved. In the comics, while Genosha remains a graveyard, there is no Wild Sentinel involved here, and instead of Shadowcat's intervention, Danger is defeated by Lorna Dane after she unleashes her power and accepts her legacy as Magneto's daughter. While in the comics, the events of Genosha break the X-Men after they find out about Xavier's sin. In the TV show, it becomes a staging ground for a renewed hope for all mutants with the birth of the X-Corp. I think this might just be one of the key differences between the show and the comics because it affects the future of the X-Men. In the end, I feel that despite their differences, both the comics and the TV show version have their own place in X-Men mythos. They each took further the storyline that they are part of in their own way, with the comics removing Charles Xavier from a pedestal and causing a schism in the X-Men, while the show making him and Lorna come to terms with their feelings regarding Magneto and uniting the X-Men. Though vastly different in the way they handle this story, they are both done really well, in my opinion. Tell me, which version of the Danger Room storyline do you guys prefer in the comments? As always, you know the drill. If you like this video, click like and share and subscribe. A subscription is the best way to be updated on all things X-Men. This is the V of Marvelous Videos. I'll be seeing you in the next one.